So congratulations to Beto O'Rourke for being the second major Democrat now to play directly into the hands of the New Zealand mosque shooter. For those of you who don't know, the New Zealand mosque shooter, part of his goals other than killing Muslims, was to try and provoke Democrats in the United States into proposing tighter gun control laws that would further polarize the United States and eventually lead to some kind of civil war or breakup. Now, of course, the New Zealand shooter was a crazy person, and he thought that this would end in, sort of racial ethno-states. I don't know where he got that idea from. Guns aren't exactly a racial issue, but that's beside the point at this stage. So Beto, for those of you who don't know, is running in the moderate lane of the Democrat Party. He's trying to run against people like Joe Biden. So Beto, he has a moderate proposal. He's saying, oh, no, I don't want to take away your guns or anything. I'm just saying, you know what? We should stop selling AR-15s in this country. But those of you who already have them, you can keep them. But no more. So far and no further. Now, what Beto's doing here, you would think, well, that's not the craziest thing he could have said. He could have said something much crazier, considering we're in a primary, but you have to keep in mind that he's running in the moderate lane. So now Beto has just staked out what is going to be the right-wing position within the Democratic primary. Because Beto is running as a moderate, every other candidate who considers themselves to be to the left of Beto, or to be not moderate, anyone who considers themselves to be liberal or progressive, will then have to take some position to the left of there. They now have to do something more extreme than just banning the sales of AR-15s. So let's think of what some examples of something more extreme than what Beto proposed could be. Now, the next iteration of Beto's policy, the next natural idea that you could, if you're trying to take this further to the left, would be to not only ban the sales of AR-15s in the future, but retroactively ban AR-15s, and so therefore telling everyone who owns one that they have to turn them in by a certain date. Now, this is actually what Australia did after a shooting back in the 90s, and people on the left always like to cite Australia and say what a great success it was, because Australia's had such low murder rates since the 90s, but of course Australia had low murder rates before that too. Now, of course, this would entail the Democrat politicians sending jackbooted thugs, essentially left-wing death squads, into the homes of any gun owner who does not give up their AR-15s, and of course that would lead to bloodshed, and probably would lead to a great bit of civil strife. If not an all-out civil war like the New Zealand shooter wanted. So let's call that the sort of middle position, banning AR-15s retroactively. Okay, so then the right-wing moderate position within the primary is just banning future sales. Well, then what is the far left option then in that case? If you're on the far left and you want to distinguish yourself from the moderates and the people who are just somewhat to the left of the moderates, well, then you have to say, at this point, I think, ban all semi-automatics retroactively. Now, by banning all semi-automatic weapons, you would get rid of pretty much most handguns and rifles in America, and the odds that the people who own all those would turn them in, like they did in Australia, is about slim to none. Even in Australia, there was a significant number of guns that were not turned in, and Australia had far less in circulation at the time of their ban than the United States does right now. As it stands, the United States has more guns than people in private hands, and of course the thugs on the left, who like to consider themselves to be such great doves and lovers of peace, always retort, sort of snidely and say, oh, well, what are these hillbilly hicks in the mountains and in the countryside going to stand up to the United States government? Well, first of all, there's many reasons why that's a very dumb point. Yes, people in Afghanistan and Vietnam had, no trouble keeping the United States government off of their land if they were invading them, which is what happened in Vietnam and Afghanistan. The Taliban, which is essentially a group of nomadic tribesmen who live in tents, they've managed to fight off the United States government from their land for almost 20 years at this point. And if you look at the maps of the way things divide in Afghanistan, the parts of Afghanistan that the Taliban doesn't control are the parts of Afghanistan where they don't live. The Taliban have done a very good job defending their own property. And of course, in Vietnam, I don't think we need to get into all the troubles there with guerrillas and essentially guys who, in many cases, were too small even to shoot a rifle. They had to put the butt of the rifle up against a tree to shoot at the U.S., and the U.S. still got their asses kicked. Because when you back someone into a corner and you come into their homes, people are going to fight to the death. Folks are not going to exactly give up when they're being invaded. That it's a very animalistic instinct. Now, putting that aside, even if the military could easily defeat the whole of the gun-owning population of the United States, you really want to, as a very kind and gentle left-winger, you want to preside over the mass slaughter of American civilians? You say that if it were possible to just simply kill all these people and purge them and take their guns away, that you'd be okay with that? The mass slaughter of civilians doesn't seem very woke to me. And the biggest problem, I think, even putting aside the inability of the U.S. military to conquer people's own property, and the inability of, I think, politically for the Democrats to carry out a mass slaughter of the right wing in America and still be considered, somehow a democratically elected government. Putting those problems aside, your police and military tend to be right-wing people who own guns themselves, so you would essentially end up with mass desertions and or rebellion. So if just because you put, let's say you put Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in as the Secretary of Defense, and she told the military, okay, you're going to fire on civilians and take all their guns away. People in the military, the infantry certainly, are not going to want to do that. The kind of guy who signs up to be an infantryman in the U.S. Army or a paratrooper or something like that, signs up because they buy into the propaganda of how they're defending, freedom and the Bill of Rights and stuff and traditional American values. And if you go in then and tell them to kill people who are just standing up for their rights, you're not going to get good results because you're countering your own propaganda at that point. That would be like the Soviet Union, recruiting a bunch of men, telling them, you know what, we're going to stick it to those damn rich people, and then having the infantrymen cart around Scrooge McDuck's gold. So in all likelihood, what you would get is if they seriously passed a ban on all semi-automatic firearms and then actually tried to implement that ban, which there's a big if there between just passing the law and actually trying to enforce it seriously. But if they try and do what they did with alcohol prohibition or the war on drugs, if there's a real war on guns in this country, you're going to see certain factions of the military and police, and I think they would be probably the majority, rebel against the government, and you end up with something like the Spanish Civil War, where there are, some military and police who are on the side of the government, other military and police who are on the side of, I guess, gun owners or just against the government in general, and that would be absolutely the worst case scenario. It's hard for me to imagine something worse than a second American Civil War, and especially if it's along the line, if it's like the Spanish Civil War, and then with modern technology. I mean, the first Civil War with, friggin' rifled muskets was still the deadliest American war in history. So the Dems need to realize that they're playing with fire here, and sure, they can say whatever they want about taking away the guns to fire up their base, but they can't actually go through with it. It's politically impossible. We're already seeing sheriffs throughout the country in places like Oregon and California declare that their counties are sanctuary counties for gun owners, and saying that the only people I answer to are my voters and not the governors, so I will not enforce an unconstitutional law, blah, blah, blah. It's the same thing that left-wing sheriffs did with, the immigration law, saying, I don't work for the president, I work for my voters, and I'm not going to, I'm going to do what's best for them. And if helping ICE is not in their best interest, I'm not going to help ICE. So even now, before there's any real serious gun control at the federal level, you're seeing law enforcement rebel against these new laws. So in closing, if you're a gun owner, I really wouldn't be too afraid, because there's no way that gun control can actually happen. But be very afraid if they try, because the consequences will be dire. If you found this video at all enlightening, I would appreciate you clicking the like button and hitting that subscribe button, because I do upload every day, and I hope that you folks will stay tuned, and I'll see you tomorrow.